In Burma, the regime's early progress on human rights has given way to worsening conditions for religious and ethnic minorities all over that country. The plight of the Rohingya Muslims is well documented thanks to groups such as United to End Genocide. The government's treatment of the Rohingya Muslims is beyond deplorable. Forced to live in what I would call concentration camps there, the Rohingya are systematically deprived of access to health care and threatened with physical harm, threatened with death. The expulsion of Doctors Without Borders, the only group providing health care to the Rohingya, and that caused 150 people to die from otherwise curable diseases, is another example. It is time that we take off the rose-colored glasses and see the situation in Burma for what it is. We cannot, we in the United States cannot continue to lavish more incentives on the government in Burma in hopes that it will one day do the right thing. And that is why I have repeatedly called on the administration to work with this committee to improve human rights in that country. We must immediately cease military-to-military cooperation with Burma until the systematic persecution of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities has ended there. Too often, the administration, like the administrations that preceded this administration, is more interested in not ruffling diplomatic feathers than carrying out the difficult but necessary task of pressing for human rights. But human rights do not have to take a back seat to strategic considerations. The administration must recognize that its rebalance to Asia will be unsustainable without improvements in this area. Countries that do not respect their citizens' fundamental human rights will not and cannot be true enduring partners to the United States. And this isn't to say that we must cut off all ties when human rights abuses occur, but it is imperative that we speak out, and that's my point. It's an imperative that we get in, lean in there, sit down with these governments and explain that these deplorable situations in Vietnam and in Burma need to be reversed. There's no excuse for silence on this issue. Now, before I turn to the ranking member, Mr. Engel from New York, the state of Maine, he most recently served as National Director of Win Without War. Ms. Janet Nguyen, Supervisor for the 1st District of Orange County, first woman supervisor to represent that district, first Asian American, first Vietnamese American to serve on the Board of Supervisors, as well as the youngest supervisor elected in our history in Orange County. And we have, thank you, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me, and thank you for convening this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for convening this important hearing. It's an honor for me to be here. I also want to thank you for the leadership that you have provided in bringing what has been an inconvenient truth about Burma to the attention of this Congress and to the public. The systematic abuse, discrimination, and assault on members of minority communities, from the Rohingya ethnic minority in the West to the Kachin and Shan ethnic minority states to the east, to Muslims who are finding themselves threatened and under attack in communities throughout Burma. I have traveled extensively in Burma over the last 3 years, and I can report to you, Mr. Chairman, that the brutal reality that I discovered in my travels contradicts the all too pervasive good news narrative of a nation securely on the path to democracy, justice, and the rule of law. I made several visits to what you aptly described as concentration camps in western Rakhine that house more than 140,000 members of the Rohingya Muslim community. These men, women, and children were marched to these camps after violence destroyed their villages and neighborhoods in Sitwe. They've been confined there ever since, living wretched lives in isolation with virtually every aspect of their lives controlled by government security. Approximately 1,200,000 additional Rohingya live in other areas of Rakhine State. While their homes and villages have not been torched in ethnic violence, they too live in fear and face restrictions on their freedom of movement, on who they can marry, on how many children they can have, on access to education, and on the construction of religious buildings. These unbearable conditions have led tens of thousands of Rohingya to leave at sea. The UN Refugee Agency estimates that some 80,000 Rohingya have fled by boats since 2012. Of those, Hundreds, if not thousands, are believed to have drowned. Those who have survived have ended up in surrounding countries such as Thailand or Malaysia, who often fall victims to human traffickers who imprison them or force them to work on rubber plantation or as sex workers until family members come up with ransom. I traveled to Malaysia, where I followed and met with some of these people and their families, and they told me personally, Mr. Chairman, that the risk that they took was greater than the living hell that they were bearing with in Burma. The suffering of the decision that you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, of the eviction of Doctors Without Borders from Rakhine State continues to this day. 150 people, in fact, died in the first 2 weeks of that expulsion, and that was the end of February. It is unimaginable how many people have died, but I've seen them. I've spoken with them. I took photographs and met with their family. And, Mr. Chairman, when you were advancing a resolution on the Rohingya on the floor of the House, you displayed photographs that I took in those camps of these people. And I'm afraid to say, Mr. Chairman, that some of those photographs, some of the families and people that you displayed on the floor have since perished. The government of Burma claims that it can fill the gap that has been left by the expulsion of Doctors Without Borders, but I can tell you that Doctors Without Borders last year alone provided more than 400,000 healthcare consultations and over 2,900 emergency referrals. There is no way the government of Burma can meet that need. While the plight of the Rohingya in western Burma, of course, is the most egregious and urgent, anti-Muslim campaigns stretch across the entire country. The infamous so-called 969 movement of extremist Buddhist monks led by Ashin Warathu, the self-proclaimed Buddhist bin Laden, systematically exploits and fans popular fear and prejudice. He calls Muslims dogs, African carp, who breed quickly and are violently, and they eat their own kind. I'm quoting now, Mr. Chairman. Such dehumanization, the use of hate speech in well-organized campaigns, the denial of basic health care, and the systematic persecution of a specific people are all known persecutors, precursors to genocide. But Muslims are not the only people under siege. Over the last 3 years, government forces tortured and raped many in the Kachin and northern Shan states. A report by Fortified Rights last month documented systematic use of torture and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment or punishment of more than 60 civilians by military authorities. Similarly, a report by the Women's League of Burma has documented more than 100 cases of rape being committed by Burma's military. It's being used, as they say, as a tool against ethnic minorities. I was in Kachin State when, in fact, Aung San Suu Kyi was elected to Parliament. And I saw firsthand the violence that were occurring in those villages. It was a stark reminder to me of the dark side of developments of Burma that cannot be ignored, even as we want to celebrate the positive reforms that have been made. Mr. Chairman, I believe that the disturbing conditions and trends in Burma require a fundamental reassessment and recalibration of U.S. Burma policy. I have outlined some of those specifically. One of them is the increasing number of high-level officials of the United States going to Burma. Secretary of State Kerry is scheduled to go there next month. President Obama is scheduled to visit Burma in November. I think all of these trips, these indicators by the United States of growing acceptance of conditions in Burma need to be questioned and challenged and stopped. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you holding this hearing. I very much appreciate your concern for the people of Burma, and I'll be very happy to answer any of your questions.
Tom, we appreciate your hard work on human rights. Janet.
Good morning.
The Constitution forbids Aung San Suu Kyi from running for president next year. Given her popularity, what impact will this provision have on the elections or stability in Burma?
Well, Congressman Engel, first of all, let me thank you for your leadership and concern on what is happening in Burma on a full range of issues, but the one that you mentioned is a very important one. Burma is not a democracy. Let's be very clear about that. The military of Burma have a guarantee of 25% of the seats in the government of Burma. They're not going to give that up. They have a guaranteed veto over any changes to the Constitution in Burma. In order for Aung San Suu Kyi to be eligible to run for president, That Constitution is going to have to change, and there's been absolutely no indication that they're going to allow that to happen. So many of the repressive policies and practices in Burma are being driven by a very unbalanced political system, a very unfair political system. And really, those that were responsible for many of the atrocities that we've discussed and many of those that existed before this major reform are still there. They might have changed their clothes. They may no longer have their uniforms on, but they are still in control, and that remains a fundamental problem.
Let me ask you another question about Burma. We mentioned it. I mentioned it in my opening statement. Can you explain why the government is instigating violence against the Rohingya, and why does the government apparently feel it's to their benefit to do so?
It's a very good question, Congressman Engel, and I've asked that of many people. There's a variety of reasons, but one of them relates to your first question, and that is this idea that the military likes to discuss of what they call disciplined democracy, that if you allow too much freedom, too much democracy, that things can get out of hand, there can be violence, and therefore a justification for an increased role and a strong role for the military, and a further excuse not to move forward with these reforms. This is not the first country in the world in which politicians have appealed to the darker nature of human beings, to bigotry, to racism, to fear, and that is very much in effect. And what my deep concern is that this is going to continue and intensify as we move forward to the 2015 elections, and political leaders and military leaders feel that they need to continue to use that card as those elections get closer.
Thank you. Let me ask Ms. Nguyen or Mr. Nguyen the questions about Vietnam.
There was obviously been a lot of reporting about the human rights and democratization reforms in Burma, and that they have stalled, and there has been significant backsliding. And in fact, a former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights said that there was an element of genocide in the attacks against the Rohingya population. So I want to ask you whether you think that's an accurate assessment, and what can we do as a country to effectively encourage the Burmese government to stop engaging in this kind of mistreatment of a very vulnerable population?
Well, thank you, Congressman. Let me go first. I have in my testimony, and certainly will be happy to discuss with you further, the report that we issued after one of my trips, Marching to Genocide in Burma. The people in Burma, the Muslim minorities and others, they're being targeted not because of anything that they have done, but because who they are, their ethnicity, and the God that they pray to. And because of that, all the things that we have described have been inflicted upon them. And that is not simply a matter of inter-ethnic tensions or religious tension. This is being done systematically with the support of the government. And that is where I think the United States needs to play a role. The government of Burma needs to be held accountable. President Thein Sein of Burma made 11 specific pledges to President Obama back in November of 2012. He has come through with only one of those 11 commitments, including the commitment to allow the UN Office of High Commissioner to have free access to the areas that are under siege, to restore the healthcare services to Rakhine State that we just mentioned, to allow credible independent investigations into these areas. And by the way, people that told me about the problem of having Doctors Without Borders thrown out, they said it's not just that. It's these independent eyes that have now been expelled from those very areas where this violence is continuing. So it's incredibly important that we establish those standards and then take action. I mean, there's various tools that we have at our disposal. We mentioned them. I mentioned them very specifically in my testimony. Specially designated nationals list needs to be identified, whether or not you're qualified for the general system of preferences. Having standards for the military-to-military relations, and not allowing it to go further unless those standards are met. For example, the Burma Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2014, Congressman Chabot is the sponsor of that. H.R. 4377 outlines specifically the conditions that we would set in order for there to be continued relations between the two militaries. All of these things could help to move us in a better direction.
Thank you. In addition to the concerns that this hearing has raised with respect to Burma and Vietnam, I also want to focus for a moment on another human rights situation in the